Berlin, 1945. The world was burning, and at the heart of it stood a man whose name would be etched in history forever, Adolf Hitler. The air was thick with smoke, and the streets of Berlin echoed with the sounds of destruction. Inside a dimly lit bunker, deep beneath the Reich Chancellery, Hitler sat hunched over a map, his hands trembling. His empire was collapsing, his enemies were closing in, and for the first time in years, fear flickered in his eyes. How did it come to this? How did a failed artist, a man once ignored by society, rise to power and bring the world to its knees? His story wasn't just about war, it was about manipulation, propaganda, and the darkest corners of the human psyche. Decades earlier, a young Hitler wandered the streets of Vienna, rejected and forgotten. He had dreamed of becoming a great artist, but fate had other plans. The rejection from art school was more than just a personal failure. It was the spark that ignited his hatred. As he struggled to survive in the slums, resentment grew inside him. He blamed the system, the politicians, the minorities, anyone but himself. The city, a melting pot of cultures, became the stage for his radical ideas. He found solace in books about nationalism and Aryan supremacy, feeding the fire of his growing beliefs. What if he had been accepted into art school? Would history have been different? By 1919, Germany was broken. The Treaty of Versailles had humiliated the nation, leaving its people desperate and angry. It was the perfect breeding ground for a leader who promised revenge and greatness. Hitler, now a passionate speaker, found his audience among those who had lost everything. He spoke with fiery conviction, painting a vision of a powerful Germany free from humiliation. He wasn't just offering hope, he was offering an enemy. Those he claimed had betrayed the nation. His words spread like wildfire, reaching those who felt abandoned. But no one could predict that this failed artist would soon command an empire built on fear and destruction. As Hitler's influence grew, so did his ambition. He joined the German Workers' Party, a small extremist group that resonated with his ideas. But he wasn't content being just another member. With his hypnotic speeches and ruthless strategies, he quickly took control, transforming it into the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazi Party. His rallies were electrifying, filled with desperate citizens who saw him as their savior. He spoke not just of change, but of revenge, of restoring Germany's lost pride. His words tapped into deep emotions, turning ordinary people into devoted followers. But behind his promises lay a sinister agenda, one that would soon turn the world upside down. The Great Depression of 1929 gave Hitler the final push he needed. With millions of Germans unemployed and starving, faith in democracy crumbled. Hitler seized the moment, promising jobs, prosperity, and a new Germany. The people, broken and desperate, listened. They wanted a strong leader, someone who would rescue them from misery. And Hitler fit the role perfectly. The Nazi Party gained power rapidly, using fear and propaganda to silence opposition. Newspapers, radios, and posters painted Hitler as the nation's only hope. Soon, democracy itself became his enemy, and he convinced millions that he alone could lead them to glory. The world watched, but few understood the storm that was coming. By 1933, Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. What happened next changed history forever. Step by step, he dismantled democracy, silencing critics and eliminating rivals. The Reichstag fire gave him the perfect excuse to crush opposition, blaming communists and tightening his grip on power. The Enabling Act gave him total control, and in no time, he declared himself Führer. Germany was no longer a democracy, it was Hitler's empire. His vision of a pure nation took shape as the persecution of minorities began. Jews, political enemies, intellectuals. Anyone who didn't fit his ideology was targeted. But the world remained blind, underestimating the depths of his ambition. What began as a promise of revival had become the birth of a nightmare. With absolute power in his hands, Hitler wasted no time in reshaping Germany according to his vision. The Nazi propaganda machine, led by Joseph Goebbels, controlled every aspect of public life. Newspapers, films, and radio broadcasts painted Hitler as a messiah, the savior of a broken nation. Schools rewrote history, teaching children that they belonged to a superior race destined to rule the world. The infamous swastika became a symbol of strength, and slogans like "Heil Hitler" echoed in every corner. But beneath this illusion of unity, fear spread like wildfire. Secret police, the Gestapo, ensured loyalty, silencing anyone who dared to question the regime. Neighbors spied on neighbors. Families turned against each other. Dissent was no longer an option, it was a death sentence. While the world focused on Germany's rising power, Hitler prepared for something far greater: war. He violated the Treaty of Versailles, rebuilding Germany's military in secret. When the world took notice, he laughed. Britain and France, haunted by memories of World War I, hesitated to act. Hitler played them like a chess master, making promises he never intended to keep. One by one, he took back lost territories, each victory strengthening his grip. Then, in 1939, he made his boldest move, invading Poland. The world could no longer look away. Britain and France declared war, but Hitler was ready. With lightning speed, his forces swept across Europe, crushing nations in mere weeks. The Nazi war machine seemed unstoppable, and for a time, it felt as if Hitler truly could reshape the world. But war wasn't enough. Hitler wanted more than just land. He wanted to erase entire populations. The Holocaust, his darkest legacy, began in secret but soon became undeniable. Millions of Jews, Slavs, and other so-called undesirables were rounded up, sent to concentration camps where horror awaited: gas chambers, mass executions, starvation. Hitler's twisted vision of racial purity turned into a nightmare for millions. Even as Germany celebrated victories, whispers of atrocity spread. Some resisted, some tried to expose the truth, but fear kept the world silent. By the time the world realized the full scale of Hitler's crimes, it was already too late. The darkness had spread too far, and the cost of stopping him would be devastating. As Hitler's forces stormed through Europe, his confidence grew unchecked. France fell in just 6 weeks, and Britain stood alone against the Nazi war machine. Hitler believed he was invincible. He turned his eyes toward the Soviet Union, convinced that one swift attack would bring another easy victory. In 1941, he launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in history. Millions of German soldiers stormed into Soviet territory, smashing through defenses with brutal efficiency. Cities burned, soldiers fell, and for a while, it seemed like nothing could stop Hitler. But he had underestimated one thing: the resilience of the Soviet people. As winter set in, his army faced a nightmare. The brutal cold stretched supply lines, and relentless Soviet counterattacks began to turn the tide. For the first time, Hitler's war machine faltered. Back in Germany, the illusion of Nazi supremacy remained, but cracks were forming. The war had drained resources, and food shortages grew worse. families received letters of their fallen sons. But the truth was hidden. Hitler refused to admit any failure, silencing generals who warned him of disaster. His paranoia deepened, and he became obsessed with absolute control. Those who questioned him disappeared. Meanwhile, resistance movements across Europe gained strength. Underground fighters sabotaged Nazi operations, smuggling information and saving lives. Even within Germany, some dared to defy him. The famous July 20th plot, an attempt to assassinate Hitler, failed, but proved that cracks in his empire were widening. The world was no longer afraid of Hitler, it was preparing to destroy him. Then came 1944, the year the world pushed back. The Allies, led by the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union, launched a massive counteroffensive. D-Day marked the beginning of the end. Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, breaking through Hitler's once impenetrable defenses. In the east, the Soviet Red Army crushed Nazi forces, pushing toward Berlin. Hitler, now isolated in his bunker, refused to accept reality. He issued desperate orders to armies that no longer existed, convinced that a miracle would save him. But there were no miracles left. His once mighty empire crumbled around him, and the world prepared for the final chapter of his reign.
By early 1945, Hitler's downfall was inevitable. The Allies closed in from all sides. American and British forces advancing from the west, while the Soviet Red Army crushed German resistance from the east. Berlin, once a proud symbol of Nazi power, had become a battlefield. Bombs rained down, streets turned to rubble, and chaos consumed the city. Inside his underground bunker, Hitler refused to face reality. He held meetings with his remaining generals, demanding counterattacks that were impossible. His most loyal officers watched in silence, knowing the war was lost. Food and supplies ran out, and outside the bunker walls, the people of Berlin suffered. The dream of a 1,000-year Reich had lasted only 12 years, and its end was drenched in fire and blood. As Soviet forces stormed the city, Hitler's mental state collapsed. He ranted about betrayal, blaming his generals, his officers, even the German people. He refused to surrender, insisting that death was preferable to capture. On April 30th, 1945, he made his final decision. In his dimly lit bunker, alongside his wife, Eva Braun, he said his last words to those who remained. Then, with a gunshot, it was over. His closest followers, desperate to erase his legacy, burned his body, hoping to keep it from falling into enemy hands. But the world had already witnessed his destruction. When Soviet troops finally reached the bunker, they found only the remains of a man who had once believed himself invincible. With Hitler gone, the war in Europe ended swiftly. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, and the world breathed a sigh of relief. But the scars he left behind would never fade. The Holocaust had taken the lives of 6 million Jews, along with millions of others. Cities were reduced to ruins, families torn apart forever. The world swore that such horrors must never happen again. Trials were held, bringing Nazi leaders to justice. Yet, Hitler's ideology did not die with him. His dark legacy lingered, a warning of how fear, hatred, and unchecked power could destroy entire nations. Even today, history remembers him not as a hero, but as a symbol of the darkest depths humanity can reach. Hitler's actions changed the world forever, leaving behind a legacy of destruction, war, and suffering. His story serves as a reminder of how dangerous unchecked power and hate can be. History teaches us valuable lessons.
We must always stand against hatred, division, and tyranny. The past should never be forgotten, so that we never repeat its mistakes.